So, hello. Before we start with the question and answers, let me just people asked me about books on the subject that we just discussed. There's one very popular. It's called Critical Transitions in Nature and in Society, which is a book which can be a good book for references, actually, because you see, it's all blah, blah, blah. Yeah. But it's scientific, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, when you say, now I want to see the real thing, I mean, are there equations, are there measurements, and so on, and you have to go to references. But it is, I mean, I don't love it so much, but I think it's a good place for references. It starts with alternative stable state, chaos cycles, and implications, and then case study. It starts with lakes. Then there's climate, but only verbal, only written in no equations. Evolution, oceans, ecosystems, humans, complex world, new approach to managing changes, and then there's an appendix with kind of 20 pages for all the math. And so if you are interested, you take a photo or just there's another one which actually I also don't like it so much, but that's for physicists and mathematicians really, because it's harder. It's extreme events in nature and society. So it's different. It's not critical. It's extreme, because this is also in nature and society. Okay, and it is much less well define it, what extreme events, because what we had seen were the critical transition in the sense that they are not reversible and so on. Here that's more on, there are these aspects, but there are also aspects like, for instance, ocean waves that are called freak waves. Freak waves are super big waves, and that they can actually damage a big boat, a ship. You know. And they are very infrequent. But I mean, that's what the meaning of extreme event is usually connected, is to things that are very, very rare, that are infrequent, but if they happen once, it's a problem. Right? So like earthquakes, for instance. Okay? Earthquakes are not, I mean, there are certain regions where the earthquakes are frequent, but the big ones, they are not frequent. So you have this poses a very difficult challenge from the point of view of using statistical methods, because you don't have data. You have very few data points. Okay? And that there is actually a subject in statistics is called extreme event statistics, rare events statistics, and so on. So anyhow, and just also people were interested in tipping points in climate and so on. I just searched for Wikipedia or something. Actually, there's a big pretty extensive article on tipping points in the climate system in Wikipedia. It's a big one. It has a lot of references. There are people from physics that have been contributing to this very strongly. The references are there. It's a guy called Kurtz, Jürgen Kurtz, the German guy. And here, this is the kind of figure that people like to show, which are the possible places where you could have tipping points which would be important for the whole climate system. Okay, so you see the Amazonas rainforest is there, instability of West Antarctic ice sheets, West African monsoon shift, and permafrost, melt of Greenland ice sheet, and so on. These have global consequences. Now, people that do models that kind of try to describe the whole climate system, which is super difficult to describe. I mean, there's all the big computers and so on. Do simple models by saying, okay, we have this. These are the ingredients. Each of them will be kind of one factor, and then they are coupled between them with differential equations and so on. Sometimes it's useful to understand a little bit the connections, but obviously not predictive in any case. But so I think that's a nice. I found it nicer than expected for Wikipedia thing. Yeah. Here is a paper, Amazon tipping point. Okay, but also blah blah blah. It's Thomas Lovejoy, which was very important, and just died some months ago, in Carlos Nobre, in Science about. But there, at least you get some references if you are interested. The same thing as this kind of thing, early warning of climate tipping points. This is older. It's already, I think, how long? Not so old, 12 years ago. And it's also all this story. I mean, you have this kind of thing that we have just seen. Then you have we have discussed this a little bit in the beginning of the course. And it's all very nice and so on, but and you want the real thing, then it is usually based on very intense computational results, which are difficult to understand because it's such a big system of equations, thousands, and then it's what the understanding of the simple, in a simple way, the things is more difficult. So, okay, this was just to give you an idea about where you can find interesting things about this. Okay, so we are open for questions. Anything from last week or whatever. I mean, it's not about today. Yeah. Mike, where's it? Here's one. Oh, no, there's one.
So I wanted to understand a little bit more about the time scales that you mentioned. Because as far as I understand, anything that multiplies the population linearly, it has a time scale of inverse time, like 1 over time. So yeah, how do we decide which term determines the time scale, and how I still couldn't grasp this very well.
It's absolutely arbitrary. Yeah. Now, so if you look, here's the equation, okay? So this comes from dimensional analysis, okay? So this is water, which is units of volume, divided by time. So you have volume over time. Okay? This one is the rainfall, and this is also volume on the rate of it. But this one also has to be volume over time. Okay, so therefore the B has B. You are already water, so B has to be 1 over time. Okay, and well then here you have more complicated things. Okay, so then you have this term and this term are both similar. Both of them have implied that there are certain there's a kind of time scale. The time scale in this case would be like if you don't have anything else, that's the typical time scale where you will have an exponential decay of the population, which is just dying or evaporating in the case. So this gives you a typical time scale. Now, here I made a changes of variables, okay, which is just to transform the system something that has a lot of ones instead of the other parameters. So that's a purely mathematical trick. And I could do this in many ways. I do it in the one that I prefer, which is I will put a 1 here. Yeah. I could have put a 1 here, and then I get something else here. Yeah. So it's arbitrary. Yeah.
But it's usually the term that determines the exponential decay. And even in more complicated system equations, this is going to be true. Like, we're not going to have another term that determines the general timescale behavior more than, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, most of the time it will be this way. And it can also be the increased term, the malthus term. It's also the same thing. It's just because it's just the difference of time. Okay, so mortality or birth. Linear term implies usually a certain time scale. I don't know, maybe you can imagine other models, like, I don't know, for instance. Well, for instance, we'll see tomorrow, Wednesday, in epidemiology, that it's not exactly the same. Okay? Okay? There's a different, there can be differences. Yeah, but there are also time scale of how long, I mean, of the duration of the infection, actually. Yeah. But, okay. There are always some time scales, but sometimes it's a little bit more variable than this. Okay.
I have a question about actually last class or the one before that. I'm not exactly sure, but in the consumer resource interactions, there was at one point a time where you created a tau to a dimensionless, a no dimension parameter of tau to make analysis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which was system was this?
The notes here.
Yeah, that's the same. Well, I can't remember now exactly. This was the simple consumer resource. Yeah, and I have introduced the tau. Yeah. This was about the time scales. Okay, just let me take note of their equation.
Okay.
And I give you back.
My question is that I didn't understand the logic behind doing that. Like, for what was it done?
Okay, I will explain. Let's write again the equations. So we had dn dt was equal to b times c times r times n minus m times n. So this was the consumer, and the resource was something which was r times r, 1 minus r over k, minus c, r times n, and then then what I was saying is that usually M is much smaller than R. Yeah? That was our point. The point was that the dynamics of decay of this guy, of the consumer, could be on a different time scale as the replenishment of your resources, which comes from here. Okay? So resources come in, and this is the kind of factor R. If R is big, then it goes quickly. Maybe it goes so quickly that the consumer population didn't even change, and it's already back to the equilibrium value for the resource. So the resource tends to an equilibrium. And then what I wanted is to find a way to have an expression with something like this, m over okay? If m is much smaller than r. And one way of doing this is, well, I could actually just multiply this equation by m, okay? No, I shouldn't. No, I cannot do this. No. So now, what I find was a new time, tau, which is what was m times t, yeah? It's correct, yeah? M times t, yeah. M. Okay, if I do this thing, now I say that all the functions r and n depend on tau instead of t. It's just a multiplication, okay? And then I say, well, now I want to write this equation with tau instead of t. But then you have the chain rule that d dt of any function is g tau dt. And this is just m. Okay? Therefore, I will change. Where I have d dt, I have to write m times d d tau. I change it. Okay? And now I divide this one by r, and I got my m over r. Okay? Now, if this is very small, then approximately this is 0, because this is the time derivative, but it's multiplied by a very small number. And then, therefore, this is approximately 0, okay? Which gives you r minus 1 r over k is equal to c over r times n. I cancel this one, and well, then I have to use the other ones and so on. But here I can write down this expression for r in terms of n. Okay, so I would have 1 minus r over k is equal to c over r times n. Therefore, 1 minus c over r times n is equal to r over k. And therefore, I put a k here. This is an expression for r. And if you put this inside here, you have an equation which is, here you have n, only one term with the r. Now the r is a function of n. Therefore, this is an equation is only a function of n. There's no r anymore. And if you work a little bit the algebra, it's a logistic. That was the idea. So the idea was, if m is much smaller than r, and in the sense that the time of input of food that's connected to r is of the resource is on a time scale which you have the consumer, but very quickly you have again a good level of resources. So then the consumer doesn't feel the resource being consumed, in the sense that it gets quickly replenishment of the resource. Okay, more. Yeah, Mike here.
I was wondering if is there a way, or what's the easiest way to incorporate evolution when we're studying population dynamics?
Yeah. Are called eco-epidemiological model, eco-evolutionary, eco-evo. Usually called eco-evo. And yeah, there is. You have to have your population dynamics, and the population has to have traits. And the traits can depend on time, or can be a stochastic variable with changes in time. And this kind of dynamics is what's called eco-evo, which is Who knows very well this is Renato. Actually, he has had several papers with Priyanka Manazekari, which is coming also, which has to do with with another person. But anyhow, he has actually done original work with this. I have never worked with evolution actually, but that's the idea that you have a trait that also can change and so on. More questions? Yeah.
Elaborate. So if we had a population dynamic that uses a trait to describe some phenomenon, the way to analyze it would be considering like which trait value can invade another, or which one maximizes the population.
Yeah, the kind of invasion analysis is common in this. Okay. The point is, this would be the easiest thing. It's just which trait has advantage. But then you also have to see sometimes if a trait has a continuous value, say, could be hate, continuous value. What's the dynamics of this trait in the population, for instance? Sometimes you have diffusion of the trait value in the population, for instance, which is a tendency to homogeneity, but sometimes not. Sometimes there's concentrating in several in values and so on, and this connects with many ideas of if evolution is, I don't know, how it's called, convergent or not, or there's also a lot of research connected to this population dynamics and evolution to study speciation, the appearance of new species, which is usually made with more on computational things, which has a population dynamics and has a population of what they call a genome of 100. It's just a string of 100 values, 0, 1, and you define a measure of distance between genomes and say if they're still the same species or not, and then you look at this to and you have some rules of birth processes or death processes or movimentation and so on. You can have a lot of things, and then you run this kind of models. Actually, Flavius knows this very well. It's part of I think of her PhD or postdoc, and they have very interesting things like usually speciation is connected to geographical separation in general, but for instance, you can see that there's also speciation with neutral models. There's no separation of the emergence of patterns which represent different species can happen also without the geographical divide. The geographical divide is obvious. I mean, you take one part of the mountain to this line, they don't communicate, and then you will have different things. Okay, but then it's also possible to have. I think it's called sympatric speciation. Sympatric is at the same place. This kind of models are very nice also, and if you're interested, then I think you should talk to Flavia. She knows a lot about this. One person. We have time.
About the equation we learned today about the absorption, basically the consumer resource of vegetation. We studied that for semi-arid climate, but would that be applicable to any other climate or situation?
No. Okay, this guy here.
Yes.
Yeah, good question. I mean, I'm not sure if, because this came from lab results. I don't know exactly the details that if they used the soil that was already a little bit which has characteristics of semi-arid regions or not. So that's detail of the experiment they conducted, so I don't know. But in principle, what is known is that the water uptake usually happens non-linearly. If it's the same 2 or 3 or this I don't know. But the water uptake is usually non-linear. But I know. I mean, the rest is, this comes from parameterizations made by people that have done these experiments a long time ago. And it's kind of standard in soil science. But
I see. And was the experiment made with bigger scale plants, bigger scale vegetation?
I don't know. I think it was not very big scale. I don't think so.
It's because I also started thinking if that equation or the other consumer resource related equation could be applied to other photosynthetic organisms such as cyanobacteria, phytoplankton, and such.
Yeah, photosynthetic. So, a consumer resource probably with the abiotic resource, right? Photosynthesis. Now, if this kind of nonlinear behavior here, I don't know if this is present in other equations, and I know it only connected to vegetation dynamics. Okay? But consumer resources that we were talking before, yeah, I mean, then that it would be a primary consumer from photosynthetic, and then you can have this kind of model.
I mean, it's kind of one derived from the other, right? One is based on the other, basically, right?
Yeah, but I mean, here you have this power 2 here, which was not present here. This power 2 here changes everything. Okay? Without the power 2, you don't have alternative stable states. You have essentially an abiotic Lotka-Volterra model, and which is going to a fixed point with all this the same. It's because of this quadratic guy here. That's what makes possible the existence of two more the zero solution and two others. And if you don't have this, you would not have this same thing.
Are there deterministic models that take into account behavior, or is it always another type of model?
Yeah, they're deterministic models. So this is connected to game theory. So game theory is something like you have probably heard about. You can have, for instance, it's used to try to explain cooperation in human societies. And you have usually two players. Then they can associate or cooperate or not. So there's this prisoner's dilemma and so on. And this can be translated to models. And then you think about that this game is played continuously. And then you have something which is called adaptive dynamics, which is population dynamics, but with behaviors. Okay? The point is, obviously, this is a very unidimensional thing about behavior. In particular, I think a critique is in biology, in ecology, the fact that if I'm a rat, I give rise to another rat, it's genetically hardwired. While for behavior, they use an analogy, which is my behavior, I can give rise to other people that have the same behavior. Okay? But this is not hardwired. This is kind of analogy. And I think people should take care with that, actually, because don't take too much the results of this kind of logic of game theory. It is not hardwired. It's like, well, you can use game theory for genetics also. The behavior usually, for instance, is modeled by this kind of thing.
So just to clarify, there aren't deterministic models?
There are. I mean, they are deterministic.
Okay.
They are deterministic, I mean, differential equations. Okay.
And I was thinking of the example of like birds of paradise that have many different behaviors, and there was speciation because of behavior.
Yeah. So this kind of thing, it's because I was thinking more in behavior in human societies, which is choices, which is not the case in many cases for, depends on the animals, but anyhow, it could not be the case. And then what you would have to do, it's usually is to divide your population, the ones that have a certain behavior and the others have the other behavior, and then they somehow interact, depends on the situation. And then, for instance, you could have that one of the behavior gets excluded, for instance. Could happen. Exclusion of one behavior and so this is also, it's also a little bit connected with sometimes with this eco-evo dynamics. Like you have behavior can be, if it's associated to a trait and discrete traits, then you could have also some evolutionary thinking on top of that. So if the behavior, obviously the behavior must influence somehow the rates of birth or death. Otherwise the behavior doesn't matter. So
okay, we were talking about tipping points before, and this interests me a lot. We saw one type of it, I guess. One type of tipping point, which was I don't know how to describe that, just like a sudden change. Are there other types of it?
Or is?
Other types of tipping points, like noise, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, there are other kinds of transitions. Okay. So one thing is when you can have this kind of thing that we briefly discussed with a small ball on a potential of a double well. So, for instance, you have a ball here. Okay. So now here you can have several things. And one thing is this height obviously is an important factor. Okay? Now, so this would be our rainfall. That's our A. Okay? That's the parameter which actually states how difficult it is to jump from one to another. Okay? Now, obviously, this can be easily modeled by polynomial of order 4, and then you could have A varying, and then there's a point that will be like this. And then here you have a transition, because this is not any more stable. It's only this one. Yeah? So it's a kind of tipping point. It's not, you see, it's not exactly the same thing. Okay? But this is also one transition that's possible. And then there's this thing here, that even here you have two stable fixed points. Okay? And if you are under stochastic perturbations, okay, which corresponds to, say, kick the ball at a certain frequency, and then you could have the rare events, like let's say the kicking, the force has some kind of distribution of intensity of the kicking, measure that somehow. And you have this. And then, well, sometimes you, maybe if you kick for a long enough time, you will get some outliers here, which could be sufficiently strong to go from one place, one tipping, from one stable point to the other stable point. And then you stay here. And this is, it's more common when instead of this is here like this already looks like a Gaussian, okay? And Gaussian do decay exponentially for very large values. But could be that there was something different, okay? Something like this, which has what people call a long tail. And then these events are not anymore so rare. Okay? They are rare, but they are not exponentially decaying. And then you expect to have more of this kind of transitions. So this is connected to what's called, people call Levy flights. Okay? It's flights because what? No, never mind, I can explain it. So this is also a transition. And then there, for instance, there are transitions that are continuous, okay, and not necessarily critical. Okay? These are the things, but the point always is that the discussion is much more about the critical transitions. Why? Because critical transitions are not reversible, while others sometimes can be reversible. So that's more or less the point. Most of the time, when you see discussion about tipping points, I think people are thinking about critical transitions.
Yeah, that's what my question was about, because I only could think of critical conditions. Can I keep going?
Yeah, sure.
Can you go back to the article that you were showing?
To
the article that you were showing last.
There
was an article that was open.
An article. Okay. Let me see. Let's see first the computer. Come on. Which one?
This one. The other.
This?
The other one.
Or the previous one?
The previous one. So when I read that, like when it says early warning of climate tipping points, it seems like it's something like that's. It seems like the focus of it is trying to understand early signs of tipping points, and that to me is something I don't know. It seems like a prediction model, and this is always something that I know it's hard. I mean, do you know if that's
it is. The point here in all this discussion is the early warning. Okay, the tipping points, maybe they exist or not, but I mean, there's a clear concept. The early warning is, could I have an idea if I'm near a tipping point? It's not completely prediction, because could say, if I know this, maybe I can change the trajectories, okay? But here, I think this discussion is much more about what they call tipping elements. This is the kind of thing that we had here. These would be the tipping elements. And then if one of them happens, maybe it will trigger the others. But I think all of this is a little bit hand-waving thing. Okay? Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I have sometimes the impression that well, the story about the early warning, it really over the last 5 or 6 years, pretty much decreased in interest from people, because it's not early. It's just a characterization. Okay? Characterization is also important. Okay, you say, yeah, have the characterization. Shift happens, but yeah, it's happening. But I can't say when it. I want to know before. And this early thing is the difficult thing of the nature of this kind of transition. But, okay, I showed you that. Well, for instance, you had this vegetation cover thing that have a spatial pattern. This is an early one. That's actually, because you have the spatial extent, and you see that your vegetation is changing in the patterns, the spatial patterns. So this is an early one. This is good. But the others, so the idea that there could be a systematic way of extracting information about tipping point, early signals of tipping points, just from time series analysis. This has been, I think, correctly claimed that although there's a lot of interesting things were done and so on, but it's never early enough. I mean, it's always too late. And then it's more in characterization than early warning. But sure, you could have things, if you understand well these elements here, and then you could have things like, I see that something is happening here, maybe I can predict, I don't know, a cascade of events, maybe.
My question is also about tipping points.
Yeah, it will work. It's always the same.
How can we know if a new state is stable or not? I mean, how long do we have to wait, or
To know
how can we test whether
the current state of
can we test whether the change is irreversible on a consistent scale?
Yeah, this is difficult. Well, usually you have some theory which can be conceptual or mathematical, but you have usually to have, in order to have, you have to have feedbacks, nonlinear feedbacks, and maybe you have evidence for this empirically, for instance, that could happen. And then, for instance, let's go for this, back to the case of Amazonian forest and so on. So you know a lot of things about the circulation of air and water in the atmosphere. These things are very well understood from the point of view of physics. There are lots of equations and equations from atmospheric sciences and so on. So you know a lot of things, know a lot of theory, and you know that, well, there is this feedback circulating between the forest evapotranspiration of and which makes the rain, what's called convective rain, a rain that is not coming from a front. It's just raining and evaporating locally, and then you go and measure and say what's the importance of this amount of water and what's the importance of the amount of water that comes with the streams. And well, if you just then you have to know a little bit about the relation of the coverage of the forest with the evapotranspiration, which could be nonlinear also, but this is also in principle doable. So you will have arguments in favor of being critical transition or not, because there are things that come, for instance, from hard knowledge, like the equations of fluids, which is all the stuff. And then, well, there are other then you will see there are feedbacks and that makes you believe that this can happen, okay? Now, this is one way of thinking. And the other thing is that people actually do work with this super enormous supercomputers for climate. And so they build scenarios. Let's say there's this kind of change or that kind of change. What would this imply? And then they find some scenarios where you have this an irreversible situations of for instance, of savannization. Right? And then, because the good with the computer say, okay, it's savanna. Now let's imagine that we take some action. Will it regenerate or not? And on the computer you can do this. Okay? And so obviously there are enormous number of parameters in these computers, and then can be always have to take caution if this is made in a sound way. But it can be done. That's why you have this international panel on climate change. That there's hundreds and hundreds of people, of scientists, and they peer review, and they kind of create certain models are models that are reliable. Right? So that's more or less what is happening, for instance, in climate. So in the other cases will depend on the particularity of the situations. Okay? So then it's not always obvious that a tipping point is a tipping point. Could be reversible or not, and so on. Depends on the knowledge of the processes. One thing that about this is that when you have a process with a tipping point, if you have some variable of your system, right, temperature or whatever, level of water and so on, if you have a transition, if you have a time series, say you have a signal, yes, time, here's some signal. This is like this, right? And then you go like this. In this region, you calculate the correlation between one point and the next one, and they are very strong because they are going directly down, for instance. While here you go up and down. Here they are probably less correlated, but here they have a super correlation. So this is characterization of something that has all the aspect of a critical transition. More? Yeah.
This is more of a curiosity, but we like simple models, right? Is there any useful model in population dynamics with higher order derivatives?
Yeah, there is. It's polemical, but it's with second order derivatives. Yeah, this introduces inertia. This introduces inertia. And I can't remember exactly, but it's connected to populations which have an important effect of maternal investment. We have behavioral of taking care of offspring and so on. I mean, this is very important in certain populations. Then there are models, but which are models that have second order derivatives. But more than this, I've never seen. But second order, there are this kind of models. Okay? But I think this is not. This is interesting. A person that has worked a lot with this is a guy that I mentioned before. It's called Ginsburg. And this guy was the guy that entered into this the polemical thing about the nature of predation, which he has proposed a model which is ratio dependent instead of the usual predator-prey dynamics, and he has a dispute with Peter Abrams, and they then wrote together a paper, okay, about what they agree and about what they disagree. And this guy, he's a troublemaker, obviously, but I mean, very intelligent one. And so he has a book. It's called Ecological Orbits about second order degrees and so on. But I mean, this is just an image. It's not central to ecological theory.
So one thing that I think that it's kind of interesting is optimization and control problems. And I've heard of some in ecology that were related to fishing and some others about pest control. Can you give examples of some more?
So, well, it has to be a system that you can manage. So the classical example is fishing, harvesting in general. Let's think about fishing. And then this could be trivial in the sense that maybe you have just some equation, like a logistic, but you have fishing increasing the dash rate, and then you have a transition, and so on, blah, blah, blah. This is easy. But for instance, for fishing, there are much more elaborate also models about the harvesting, about fishing, because there are some of them, some species like codfish, that has, for instance, there has been an extinction of codfish in the Balkan Sea, and this is a kind of thing that people don't understand exactly what happened, and it seems that the problem is that the fish, I mean, the fish have very different sizes and very different ecological interactions depending on their age or their size. Okay? So there are interesting problems of you could you fish only the big ones, or should you fish the small ones, and which would determine the size of the nets you could use, and so on. So this has been studied with optimization, and with optimization theory. Yeah. We have actually tried, but we didn't try hard enough. When we worked with this story about the Cantareira water reservoir and so on, what would be the optimum strategies for water extraction? Okay, but well, I don't remember. The point is that all the system changed after in 2016. There was again water, and nobody was interested in the Cantareira system anymore. But this was also an aspect we didn't publish this, which was interesting to consider. Yeah. So this is, yeah. You raised your hand? No. So yeah, I actually a recent work about using optimization, but in vaccine delivery for COVID-19. So, for instance, what would be how should you proceed to vaccinate in order to have the, well, you have to have a function that you want to minimize, which is usually the death rate, but could also be, for instance, hospitalization, okay? which implies also death. So it could be both. And so we have done a work with real data from using coronavac data, Pfizer and Oxford AstraZeneca, efficacies and so on, and what would be the best rates of how to always have, because you have two doses. The problem is 2 doses, okay? If you use all your doses now, you cannot anymore vaccinate the second dose, and you actually are doing a very bad job. Therefore, you have to, but on the other side, on the hand, if you take too few now, you will have vaccines that you want to use for, will be there. You could vaccinate, but you are not. Therefore, you are saving less virus. So what's the optimal level? This is, we have done something else. But this is a typical optimization problem. More questions? Yeah. Yeah.
So I was thinking about this problem that we approached today, about the consumption of water, not consumption, but like absorption of water by the vegetation. And I'm recently, well, I'm thinking about a related problem in my dissertation that involves also the development of the amount of water across time with across time, where with respect to precipitation. But in my problem, I also have to consider containers of water in which they can be filled. Yeah. So there's a maximum amount of water. So I was thinking that to put, how to say this, a carrying capacity in this. Does that make sense?
Well, I'm not a specialist on your system, but yeah, I mean, yeah, could be a carrying capacity, the maximum amount of water that can be stored. Actually, in more involved models, they have something like this, because they have the water that is superficial and the water that goes down. And the down, it's of no use for the plant, okay? And then you have problem of saturation. Sometimes you have to have first water that goes down and saturates a certain part, and then water on the superficial part where the plants live. So there are kinds of carrying capacity for water in that situation, which is not included here, but the people do this kind of thing. There's a maximum amount of water that can be used. More one. Today I can finish a little bit earlier also. I mean, I don't like it to have two classes, one on top of the other on the same subject. But if you have more questions, it's time to speak now. Yeah.
I was curious about what's the maybe easiest way in our approach to incorporate spatial effects on our models.
Spatial effects, yeah. So the typical things, let's say you have the logistic. Right? So there are two ways I mean, there are many ways, but one classical way of incorporating is to say, now instead of total population, I talk about density of the population, which can be dependent on the space. Okay? So usually we use rho as the density. It depends on x and t. X can be a vector, but many models are just written with one dimension because they are toy models anyhow. So then this here, you will calculate the partial derivative for time, and you say, well, let's assume that this is logistic. Okay? So you would have something like this. It's a kind of carrying capacity, but it's a little bit different with for densities. And then you have to see what happens in respect to x. The most common thing is to say that you have a coefficient d and you have diffusion. Okay? So there's a nice problem that if you don't have this one, the diffusion equation, you start with something here, and over time it will spread out homogeneously like this. Okay? While if you have this, over time, after a long time, you will have a propagating front instead of a decaying Gaussian. Okay? This is a nice problem. And this is one of the ways. Then there are more mathematical. This is old already. There are more mathematical ways which is introduce what's called a dispersion kernel. You have an integral differential equation. Okay? So because this supposes that actually your individuals are doing some kind of Brownian motion, which is not in, for instance, then you have difficulty in there's a very nice situation like that. That's a joke. I will give you the mic in a moment. So a guy that I actually know, Nitan Kenker, he is a very nice person, and he's very curious because in India has a position in US at in Albuquerque in New Mexico, but he speaks Portuguese because he was born in Goa, so and that kind of thing. Well, so he kind of was also a physicist that decided to go to population dynamics and so on, and well, they have money and so on, and it made a lot of conversations and workshops to see what would be important. And then for the regions of the south of the of US, which are arid regions, they have a problem with a particular disease, which is hantavirosis, and which can be deadly. And it is transmitted by the urine of a given rat. Okay? So the spatial distribution of this disease is given by the spatial distribution of the rats. Okay, so good, because this transforms an epidemiological model into a model of dispersion of a certain species, which is nice, it's elegant. But then, okay, Nitant came and said, let's try this equation a little bit more complicated than this, but with this. The point is, what's the value of t? Okay? So what a physicist would do? Experiment, put in, I don't know, a box like that, let the guy go on and measure the movement and see if this movement, there will be a certain average of a line, goes in a straight line and turns and turns. You take the length of this movement and you will be able to calculate this. Okay? Then, okay, he plugged it in an equation, and it gives that in a few months, all the United States would be taken by the rats. And what was the problem? Very elementary. Rats have home ranges. They don't go in. They come back to their home, like we. Okay? Therefore, they don't disperse like this. What is dispersing is the dispersion is given by the newborn rats that have to go somewhere to find a place, which is on a much slower time scale than the dispersion of everyday life movement. And actually, when you think about it, it's quite obvious. It's like with ants. Okay? They go around all the day, but this does not determine the extension where you have the ants. Okay? So this is a clear fact. So, but actually then Nitant went on to write a theory with home range analysis, a very good paper actually. So you had a question at a certain point, yeah?
So you're now talking about partial differential equations, and one thing that I always consider, that I've been considering lately, is how this kind of problem, even to solve computationally, the complexity grows exponentially with the dimension. So I was wondering, like, how often models of higher dimension than 2 appear in ecology?
In higher dimension, spatial dimension, or no, or higher dimension in
just the dimension of the variables, like x and t, 2 dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
And are there usually models with 3 or 4 or 5 variables?
So for spatial dynamics, it is usually much things that's done with only 1 spatial, and sometimes with 2. Why? Why? Because most population only use 2 times. We only use 2 times, two spatial scales. We don't know the jumping is not important ecologically. So most terrestrial do this, and then if you want the birds, I mean the scale where of extent they fly is much larger than the variation in height. So they are effectively stratified, most of the movements. And therefore you have here, then you get a Laplacian here. Okay? And it's usually not very fun. I mean, most of the things that you find in one dimension, you find in two. And then so why there's no big point on doing two. But, okay. Then,
so
yeah.
Yeah. But what I meant exactly is, I didn't mean to specifically on spatial problems, because, for instance, one model that I know is time and physiological age of populations. And also in our project, I was thinking of something that was, I don't know, of higher dimension, but it's not spatial. But one thing that I was considering is that it would be very hard to solve because of the computational complexity.
If it's nonlinear, yeah.
Yeah. So I was wondering if people actually do that in any kind of problem, ecological problem, if people use try to do things in higher dimension, or is just like ignored?
So most of the time, we will be, but not necessarily one dimension. One place where you have a little bit space for having higher dimensions would be an ecological problem, an evolutionary problem. Let's say that you had this row here, and maybe you have traits. They are continuous. Then you can have also derivatives with respect to the variable of the trait, which could simulate a certain number of processes. So you could have maybe more. But I have not seen anything beyond 3, actually. Then this will depend a lot on, well, this will depend a lot of the kind of nonlinearity that you would have. So one work that can be done, which is actually very interesting, and we have not finished the paper, but it's a paper of a previous student of mine, which is looking at the spatial dynamics of species in a super fragmented habitat. So you have the habitat, there are fragments, and you can cross from one to the other, but you don't reproduce there. So then you will use a 2-dimensional diffusion equation and something like that, right? With a lot of boundary conditions and so on, which are non-trivial boundary conditions. And you put this on a computer. I mean, it's some hours of computation. But on a normal, it's not a supercomputer. It's just a better server we have here. So it's computational intensive in the sense it's not like your laptop will do it, okay? But running this on our server, which is nothing special. Even a common desktop with some good processors, half an hour, 1 hour, depends on the size of your domain and so on. So it's doable. Okay? So I think, unless you have another question, I think we could stop here today. But before, there's an announcement. So, yeah, announcement is something that may interest some of you. It is not related to ecology, but it's related with me. So now, if you are interested in modeling for epidemics and so on, we just launched this school. It's a July school. It's called São Paulo School of Advanced Science and Epidemic Preparedness. And so you take a look. If you find it interesting, you just apply. So what's the point about this? This is a super interdisciplinary thing. We have 4 building blocks. One is modeling, statistical and mathematical. This is only one of the building blocks. The other one is epidemiology done by epidemiologists in the field. The third one is policy and economics related issues to preparedness for an epidemic. And the fourth is the use of genomics as a tool to prevent or to be prepared to avoid or to be prepared for a new epidemic. So this is the general aspect. There will be people very, very famous and others that not so famous but are equally good. Yeah. There will be this, this person is pretty much famous, writes in Folha de São Paulo, Marcia Castro, and she's from Harvard. Then, where are the rest of the lectures? Why did this stop? It should not have stopped. Our lecture, it's stalled. Well, always happens. Okay, Maria Rita. It's going very slow. But there will be two superstars from epidemiology and so on. One is Neil Ferguson, which is from London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Actually, he does the mathematical modeling thing. And that's the guy that said COVID can make 2 million of persons die in the US. You better take attention. And so this is Ferguson. And this guy, Reingold, is a very famous epidemiologist, field epidemiologist. So it's super, super interdisciplinary. And the idea is that people will have to learn to talk with people that have complete different knowledge. So that's kind of also the thing here, and to a certain extent. And this will be, and this is fully, if you are accepted, you will be fully covered by hotel, air travel, whatever. Unless you are from São Paulo, then you don't get anything. But applications on a competitive basis. We have 100 students. We have already more than 100 applications, and there's still a month to go. And so, if you're interested, just take note of the name. You can find this more or less easily, and you're welcome to apply. You will need a motivation letter, a recommendation letter, a CV, and a one-page statement about your present research, like an abstract. Okay? And that's it. And due to the FAPESP financing this, and there are many rules, and one of the rules is 50% will be foreigners, about 50%, and 50% from Brazil, from all regions of Brazil. We should have this thing, and there will be a real effort to have gender equilibrium also. Okay, so that's it. Thank you.